Hello everyone, welcome to the third lecture for our module. Today we will be discussing the conditions that led to the rise of fascism and Nazism in Europe in the 1930s, and we will also be discussing the what led to that. So I will begin by explaining what I could call as the other side of the Roaring Twenties, the dark side of the 20s and the 1930s. Obviously, a key role here is the one played by the Great Depression. I won't say much in this lecture about the Great Depression because this is the topic of our tutorial presentation. So we will discuss it at length in the tutorial. At the same time, I will guide you through the rise of fascism as a political movement in Italy, and we will discuss the ideological roots of fascism and the spread of fascism and fascist ideologies around Europe. Then we'll switch to discussing the coming of the Nazi Party to power. And finally, we will zoom in the Spanish case, the case of the Spanish Civil War, Spain formed a battleground for fascist and anti-fascist forces in the mid to late 1930s. So we will discuss the case of the Spanish Civil War. Now, what do I mean by the other side of the Roaring Twenties? We need to bear in mind here that, remember, in a previous lecture I talked about a wave of radicalization that cuts across the European metropolitan centers right before the end of the First World War. It also empowers the revolutionary transformation in Russia. However, and in some cases in Europe, like in Germany, the radicalization movement, the socialists, for instance, operating in Germany, like Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, were brutally suppressed by paramilitary group. So the suppression of the post 1919 wave of radicalization in Western Europe became to some extent the breeding ground for paramilitary and fascist groups. And the case in point here is Italy and Germany. Another feature that we find in the 1920s, which again point to the, as it were, dark side of them, is the rise of authoritarianism. What do I mean by authoritarianism? I mean by regimes, the rise of regimes that it's a question mark to what extent they're fascist, but nonetheless are not quite liberal democratic. We'll get to that in a moment. And another feature of the 30s, of the 20s and the early 30s, as we go on towards the 30s, is the economic hardship across Europe and the USA that becomes important in the aftermath of the Great Depression. The Great Depression is the great financial economic crash that happens in the late 1920s. I'm sorry, I tend to confuse 1920s, 1930s here. So let me guide you through a quick snapshot of the problems, as it were, with democracy that many countries in Europe faced in the 1920s and from the 1920s to the mid-1930s. You may remember I spoke about the attempt in Hungary towards the end of the First World War to set up a socialist regime headed by Bela Kun that failed. And then there is the reconstitution of the Kingdom of Hungary by an admiral who was not very democratic, let me put it this way, Admiral Horthy. So Hungary is the first example quite early on in the 1920s that turns towards authoritarianism. Then, and I will go at great length in the second segment where I discuss fascism, the events in Italy, 1922. Let's go on to the Balkans now, Bulgaria. There's a dictatorship in Bulgaria in 1923. Southern Europe, Portugal. 3 years later, a dictatorship is established in Portugal as well in 1926. Poland, same year, turns into a dictatorial mode of government. In Yugoslavia, and we saw in the presentation details about this particular country, there is a royalist coup. So the king of the Serbs assumes power in a quasi-dictatorial way. Well, you don't need me to say anything about that. The Nazis rise to power in 1933. Then there's a dictatorship a fascist dictatorship in Austria a year later, Latvia a year later as well. A dictatorial regime comes into being in Greece as well, a bit later in the mid-30s, and Spain becomes a nodal point in this tide that Europe witnesses of the rise of authoritarianism, dictatorships, and essentially fascism. And this image, it's not quite accurate, and I will explain it in a moment, but it gives you a sense of where we are, where we stand during the so-called interwar period. By interwar we mean 1920s and 1930s, with regard to democracy in Europe. You see how the tide of authoritarianism grips the continent, and with the light color is those states who have dictatorial or even fascist governments, and effectively, if we really properly, focus on this map, what we will see is that Great Britain, Ireland, Scandinavia, France as well, don't be confused by the different colors, and Czechoslovakia are the kind of countries that maintain some degree of liberal democracy, are functioning liberal democracies. All the other states in Europe have turned into authoritarian regimes. All the other states by the mid-1930s have authoritarian fascist governments. As you probably imagine, a lot of scholars are wondering why is it that this new arrangement in the 1920s and 30s didn't support liberal democracy. On the contrary, they argue that it undermined liberal democracy. What are the key factors that explain the advent of authoritarianism in Europe? Scholars have argued that illiberal political projects gave gathered support from middle class and big businesses, and that is certainly the case, for instance, in Germany, where a lot of big industry supported the regime there. And not only, there was a second sort of explanation speaks about widespread fears for socialism and for the advent of the working classes and the traditional elites. So here we have, for instance, that might be the case in Portugal or elsewhere, the idea that the traditional elites, usually military elites and political elites, need to curtail the coming of radical politics that will probably align with the entrance of the working classes into the field of politics, where the working classes gain a bigger say, that this, in a way, challenge the power grip in these societies that traditional political elites had. So they sought to move to support more authoritarian directions. Well, specifically with regard to fascism and Nazism, these kinds of groups preyed on the instability of parliamentary democracy. And this is another key moment of the 1920s and 30s, and to some extent, it's also related to the aftermath, the effect of the global economic crisis. Parliamentary democracy became, let me put it that way, parliamentary government became more and more shaky. For instance, France was a case in point. In the 1920s, France democracy in the 1930s is very turbulent. There's elections all the time. There is a certain degree of instability. Authoritarian groups here prey on this, wish to exploit this by arguing that, well, look what liberal democracy brings. Is this really the sort of stability that liberal democracy is supposed to be bringing? Other factors also explain the rise of authoritarianism in Europe. Anti-Semitism. It exists in Europe before the 1920s and 1930s, but then it becomes particularly accentuated in places like Italy and Germany. The idea that, quote unquote, the Jews are to be blamed for our economic hardships takes foothold in these societies. Aggressive nationalism, and last but not least, the economic crisis that I spoke about. And because this is the bit of the presentation, I won't mention a lot. I'll just mention some key features. In 1929, the banking system collapses in the USA. Major lenders in the USA and in London stop issuing credit and recall their short-term loans to European states. Remember that the US was heavily invested in the recovery of Europe after the First World War. The coal and steel production falls by up to 60% worldwide. And in a matter of a few years, 20 million Europeans become unemployed. And in Germany in particular, who suffered from the aftermath for having to pay the reparations, etc., in the aftermath of the First World War, in Germany, the rate of unemployment doubles within 5 years. And these are crucially the 5 years that the Nazi regime consolidates its power, its grip on society. And a key debate, and I would like us to discuss this in a tutorial, is the question about the so-called gold standard, that divides at the time European states and societies on how to deal with the economic crisis. However, I should say here, and before I move on, that, and I hope it's clear that the economic crisis and the global economic crisis was actually one reason that explains the rise of authoritarianism in Europe. It's not the determining factor. However, it plays a key role. Now, another thing I would like to clarify here, another point is, the difference between fascism and authoritarianism. Were all these kinds of regimes that I talked about earlier fascist? Let me give you an example here. The regimes in Portugal and Spain, or the agrarian quasi-fascist states in Eastern Europe, relied on the support of traditional elites like the Catholic Church, the army, and shared the anti-Bolshevism of the Italian and the German regimes. So that's something that kind of they had in common. But there was no expansionist ideology beyond what they acknowledged as the historic limits of their own nationality. So they didn't really have any project of world domination, as it were. And more importantly, there was in these kinds of regimes, most importantly Portugal and Bulgaria, Poland, etc., there was no attempt to create a mass movement from below, predicated on the principles of fascism. So this is what kind of distinguishes the different regimes that we have in Europe from the Italian and the German case. Well, the Spanish case is somewhat closer to the Italian case, but nonetheless, there in Spain, as we shall see in Franco, we don't quite have an expansionist motive there. Whereas in Italy and specifically in Germany, we have plans for world domination that exceed the boundaries of what the nation state is at the time. I will pause this segment here, and when we come back to the second segment, I will explain in greater detail the rise of fascism in Italy, and I will discuss the broader concept of fascism and its core features.